one of the things that I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub-goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s, is to see, okay, like discipline yourself. You think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And, if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this if they're doing an experiment too. If you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is. See if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient. Regulate your habits. Try to get up at approximately the same time each morning. I would recommend that you get up approximately when other people get up. So that would be something in the neighborhood of 7:30 or 8 in the morning, perhaps earlier, perhaps a little bit later, but you want to stabilize that, because your circadian rhythms operate more, fluidly, and your mood is likely to be regulated better if there's islands of stability in your daily routines. Human beings like daily routines, just like dogs like daily routines. And so regulate your sleep. I would say when you get up in the morning, eat breakfast. That's a really important thing to do. I can't tell you how many people I've treated in my clinical practice whose proclivity for emotional instability and depression, anxiety, general hopelessness, emotional pain and gloom and doom, as well as capacity to concentrate, were properly regulated or inhibited or reduced by merely ensuring that they ate a protein and fat rich breakfast relatively soon after they wake up. And that's especially true if they're stressed. And as it turns out that if you stress yourself after a fast, which is of course what you've undertaken if you haven't eaten since the night before, that your body produces enough insulin to deplete the sugar in your blood. And then it's very difficult for you to become regulated properly with regards to your metabolism until you sleep again. And so it can be regulating your sleep, and your breakfast eating habits in particular can be a very effective way of regulating your mood and increasing your capacity to concentrate. The other thing I would say is that scheduling your time is also extraordinarily useful. And so I can tell you a little bit about how to use schedules effectively. You should develop a long-term plan. So you have to set up your long-term vision. And then I would say, once you set up that vision so that you know how to orient yourself, then you should start designing your days. And you can do that very effectively with a calendar like Google Calendar. Many people say, well, I hate using a schedule, or I hate using a calendar. What you're doing is using the calendar as an external tyrant that's telling you what you should do if you were going to be a conventionally good person each day. So you load yourself up with arbitrary responsibilities. But that's not really how you should use a schedule. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. But it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, that it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. So maybe what you do, you say, okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplish, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. And then practice incrementally, day by day, trying to inculcate the habits that you want to inculcate. And assume that it'll take you a number of months or even a number of years in order to become very fluent at the habit. The important thing is to start improving incrementally, because incremental improvement pays off like compound interest.
Young people like to think about ways to change the world, right? And that's actually a positive part of their development. It's a stage that the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget called the messianic stage, and he associated that with late adolescence. While young people want to change the world, the problem is that that's been harnessed into attempts to change other people. But that isn't what you should do. If you want to change the world, you should change yourself. In the sense that Alexander Solzhenitsyn said when he analyzed the Soviet Union, he said, don't be thinking that the line that divides good from evil runs down political spectrum or countries or something like that. It runs down right down the middle of your soul. And if you want to sort out the world, then what you do is you sort yourself out. It's a serious business. They say it's more difficult to rule yourself than to rule a city, because you're complicated and there are horrible monsters inside of you that need to be tamed and to be brought into alignment and submission so that you can be a powerful and useful person. And instead of rushing out there to change the world by changing other bad people, that they should look inward and sort themselves out properly. And if you have a memory that's more than 18 months old, approximately, and when you pull that memory up to mind, if you still have an emotional reaction, that means you haven't fully articulated the memory. You haven't analyzed it causally. You haven't freed yourself from its grasp, and you're carrying it like a weight. And your brain responds to that. Like the more weight you're carrying like that, more baggage, let's say, the more of the stress hormone cortisol your brain produces. And cortisol makes you old. Divide your life up into 6 epochs. And then divide each of those, that might be, say, birth to kindergarten, and then maybe elementary school, and then maybe junior high school, however you want to do it. And then to write about the emotionally significant events in each of those epochs, and then to describe their effects on you, and then to analyze how you did in those situations, what you might have done differently, what you might do differently in the future, to straighten out your past. This old client of mine, he was about 85 when he came to see me, and he was a financier and a kind of a mathematical genius. He made these little pendants out of a mathematical symbol for the most beautiful mathematical equation that was ever written. He made them out of gold, and he would hand those out. And he had studied psychology as a young man, and he introduced me to this concept that I didn't know about, called the Pareto distribution, which, see, I'd been taught as a psychologist that most human characteristics were normally distributed, right? So most people were average and some people were extreme. That's a Pareto or a normal distribution. Intelligence is like that, and height, there's more people of average height than very tall or very short, and weight is like that. And lots of things are normally distributed, and psychologists tend to assume that everything is, but it isn't. Creative products are distributed in a Pareto distribution, and that's a whole different thing. And it's really important to know this. It's another fundamental fact, the knowledge of which can sort of transform the way you conceptualize, let's say, the political landscape. So here's an example of the Pareto distribution. You know, there's a rule of thumb that if you run a company, that 20% of your employees do 80% of the work, or that 20% of your customers are responsible for 80% of your sales, or that 20% of them are responsible for 80% of the customer service calls. Same thing. But that's not exactly the rule. The rule is worse than that. The rule is, in a given domain, the square root of the number of people operating in that domain do half the productive work. So you think, well, you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work. It's like, yeah, okay. What if you have 100 employees? Then 10 of them do half the work. What if you have 1,000 employees? Well, then it's 30. And if it's 10,000 employees, then it's 100. And this actually turns out to be a rather ironclad rule. It applies across very, very many situations. It applies, for example, to the mass of stars and the size of cities. So you can see how universal it is as a law. And it's something like those that have more get more, and those that have less get less. That's the Matthew principle, right? To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. And the economists sometimes call that the Matthew principle. And so what that lays out is a world that's rife with inequality. So you hear this idea that I think it's the 85 richest people in the world have more money than the bottom 2 billion. That's a Pareto distribution phenomena. And you might say, to hell with capitalism for producing that. It's like, sorry, you got your diagnosis wrong. It's a natural law. It's no matter what society you study, you get a Pareto distribution of wealth. You get a Pareto distribution of number of records recorded. You get a Pareto distribution of number of songs written or goals scored. Like any creative product has that characteristic. And it's partly because as you start to become successful, let's say, people offer you more and more opportunities. And as you start to fail, people move away from you and you plummet. And so, okay, so that's rough. So what it means is that there is always a landscape of inequality. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything about it, although I am saying that we don't know what to do about it. That's the thing, because you can modify the Pareto distribution of wealth, let's say, but we don't know how to do it without maybe disrupting the system so completely that it collapses, which is what happened in the Soviet Union, for example, and in Maoist China. They were trying, at least in principle, to adjust inequality. But the cure was far worse than the disease. And the truth of the matter is we actually don't know technically how much inequality there has to be to generate wealth. We can guess, and you could say, well, there should be less, and you might say, well, there should be more. If you're left-wing, you'd say less, and if you're right-wing, you'd say, well, we'll just let the inequality flourish. But we do know that it's inevitable, and we also know that we don't know how to regulate it. So there is inequality. What that means is there's always going to be people around that are better at something than you are. And that's a problem, because you can get jealous and you can get bitter and you can get resentful, and worse, you can get hopeless, because you look like I have this friend of mine. He told me something so funny. He was decrying his lack of success in the world, and he compared himself to his roommate. And he said, his college roommate was doing much better than he was. And his bloody roommate was Elon Musk. It's like, really? It's like, oh, you're not doing as well as Elon Musk. Well, you can see it would take it rather personally, because they were roommates and everything. It wasn't like he was doing badly. Like, he was doing pretty damn well. It's like, I'm not as good as Elon Musk. It's like, yeah, well, you and like 7 billion other people, But I thought it was instructive because you have to be careful who you compare yourself to. Now, you can't just not compare yourself to successful people, right? Because then you don't have anything to aim at. And one of the things I learned from Jung, this was a cool thing, I'm going to make a real lateral move here. Jung thought the book of Revelation was appended to the Bible because the Christ in the Gospels was too merciful. He was too nice a guy. Now, he's an ideal, right? And Jung said, wait a second, an ideal is always a judge. That's the thing about an ideal, because you're not as good as your ideal, so your ideal is a judge. And Revelation has Christ coming back as a judge, and that was Jung's explanation at the level of the collective unconscious for the pasting of that remarkably strange and terrible book onto the end of the Bible. So, anyways, my point is an ideal you need an ideal because you have nothing to aim at, but an ideal is a judge, and you always fall short of the ideal. So how the hell can you have the benefits of having an ideal without having the crushing blow that goes along with having the judge that always regards you as insufficient? So I was trying to work that out in the chapter, and this is something I've had to work out a lot as a clinical psychologist. It's like, well, let's say you need a goal, but we don't want to let your distance from the goal crush you. So you got to set up a goal, and then you got to break the goal down into parts so that you can move towards it, and you have a fairly high likelihood of doing it. So that's a bit of practical, I wouldn't say advice, it's because it's better than advice. It's some practical knowledge about how to go about achieving an aim. Set a high aim, but differentiate it down so you know what the next step is, and then make the next step difficult enough so you have to push yourself past where you are, but also provide yourself with a reasonable probability of success. It's also what you do with children, right? You want to push them because They need to grow up and be more than they are, right? But you don't want to crush them with constant failure. So what you do is aim high and make the goal difficult but proximal. So anyways, so that's one way of looking at it. But then the next thing is, you know, I've had clients, many clients in their 30s, who are trying to, this is more true with women, I would say. A lot of women who are very high achieving and who established their career goals at 30 and then want to differentiate out their life. They want to have a husband, they want to have a family, they're trying to figure out how to do that. And one of the things I've noticed that around 30, you really have to stop comparing yourself in some ways to other people. And the reason for that is that the particularities of your life are so idiosyncratic that there isn't anyone really all that much like you, you know, because the details of your life happen to matter. And so maybe you compare yourself to some rock star or something like that, and you know, the person's rich and famous and glamorous and all that, but you know, they're alcoholic and they use too much cocaine and they've had 3 divorces, and it's like, how the hell do you make sense out of that? Is that someone that you should judge yourself harshly against or not? The answer is you don't know, because you don't know all the details of their lives. And who do you know that you can compare yourself to? That's easy. You. Yesterday. So here's a good goal. It's something like, well, aim high. And I really mean that. It's like, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. Aim high, but use as your control yourself. It's like, so your goal is to make today some tiny increment better than yesterday. And you can use better, you can define better yourself. This doesn't have to be some imposition of external morality. You know where you're weak and insufficient, where you could improve. You think, okay, well, this is what I'm like yesterday. If I did this little thing, things would be just an increment better. And, well, that's a great thing, because you get the ball rolling, and incremental improvement is unstoppable. You can actually implement it, and it starts to generate Pareto distribution-like consequences. It starts to compound. And I've seen that happen in people's lives over and over. Well, people write me all the time and tell me that they're doing that, but I've seen that happen in people's lives continually. They make a goal that, the goal should be, how could I conceive of my life so that if I had that life, it would clearly be worth living, so I wouldn't have to be bitter, resentful, deceitful, arrogant, and vengeful. Like, that's sort of the bottom line, right? Because that's what endless failure does to you. It's not good. And that's what life without purpose and a goal does to you as well, because life is very hard. So you think, okay, well, I need to adopt a mode of being that would justify my suffering. And you can ask yourself that question. What would make this worthwhile? I quote Nietzsche, I think in that chapter. He said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." That's a lovely line, man. I mean, it's a lovely line. And it's really worth thinking about. So you think, well, how do I manage all this misery and suffering and futility? It's like, well, I need to figure out what I would have to do in order to make that clearly worthwhile. And so then you have your goal, and then you think, well, I need to move towards that incrementally, because I'm kind of useless and can only do so much, and maybe not even that. But all I have to do is be a little bit better than my miserable self yesterday. And that'll propel you forward very rapidly, and you can succeed at it, which is also really lovely, because why not set yourself up for success, you know, because otherwise you'll droop around like a number 10 lobster, and you know, that's just not good. You get all pinchy when that happens, and it's not a good thing. Every time you learn something, you learn because something you did didn't work. And that exposes you to the part of the world that you don't understand. Every time you're exposed to a part of the world that you don't understand, you have the possibility of rebuilding the structures that you use to interpret the world. That's often why it's more important to notice that you're wrong than it is to prove that you're right. One of the things that you're supposed to learn in university is precisely that. It might be useful to listen to people that annoy you on the off chance that they know something that, if they tell you, you can use instead of dying. Talking to people who agree with what you say is like walking around in a desert. You already know everything that they say. The reason you're associating with them in that situation is so that they never say anything that challenges you, because you're afraid that if you go outside of what you understand, that you won't be able to tolerate the chaos. But it isn't the case. People have an unbelievable capacity to face and overcome things they don't understand. And not only that, that's essentially what gives life its meaning. The Buddhists say life is suffering. And you think, well, if that's the case, why bother with it? And people do ask that question, and they ask it in ways that result in their own destruction, and worse, in the destruction of others. So, for example, people who become particularly cruel, particularly in a genocidal manner, are more than willing to dispense with as many human beings as they can possibly train their sights on, because they're so disgusted by the nature of human limitation that they'd rather eradicate it. And lots of people become suicidal because they can't bear the conditions of their own existence. And suffering is real, and it's inescapable. So the question is, what do you do about it? Well, so you're moving from point A to point B in your little circumscribed world. You've made everything invisible, and as long as that works, then your theory's good enough. It's accurate enough, it's true enough, you're in your little paradise. But if something comes up and objects, well, that's where your character is tested fundamentally. That's the character test. It's like, what do you do with messages of error? And that's a tricky issue. Okay, so here's a solution to that. Here's what not to do. I am a bad person. I got to see myself. I'm a bad person. I might as well just go jump off the bridge. It's like, no, that's not good, because what that means is that every time you try to learn something, you're going to make a mistake, because what do you know? So you're going to make mistakes. And if the rule is every time you make a mistake, you're going to go jump off the bridge, then that's not a useful problem-solving strategy. And so when you make a mistake, you don't get to beat yourself to death with a club. It's a bad strategy, and you'll have your internal tyrant in there who's perfectly happy about doing that. That's the, overactive superego that Freud talked about. Maybe it came to you via a parent who was too authoritarian, or a grandparent, or maybe it's just you because you're disagreeable and neurotic, and so you'll take or hyper-conscientious, you'll take yourself apart. Well, you've got a problem. Something has objected to you. Then the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe you're not looking at the world right. Maybe your goals are wrong, maybe you're not acting properly. It's okay. So the question that arises when an obstacle emerges is, which part of this structure needs attention? And the first answer can't be all of it, which is why when you're arguing with someone in an intimate relationship and you're angry at them and you want to win, which is a big mistake, you want to win, you say, well, this is what you're like. Here's another 10 examples of how you've done that in the past, and I can enumerate more of them if you'd like. And so that's actually what you're like, and I've tried fixing you and it didn't work, and so it looks like you're going to be like that up into the future. And you're basically saying to them, well, you're a bad person, and the only thing they can do is either collapse or punch you. And punching you is actually better than collapsing. You know what I mean? It's such a counterproductive way of arguing. You don't leave the person any out. And so maybe, well, they're civilized, so it doesn't get physical. Well, maybe that's good and maybe it isn't. But then they end up either really not happy with you in a way that they will manifest the first possible opportunity they get, or they have to go off in the corner and cringe. It's like, great, you won. It's like now your partner's either hates you or is cringing. It's great. That's a real good victory, man. Rack up about 100 victories like that and you'll be in divorce court and spending $250,000 while being miserable about it. Yeah. So anyway, something objects to you and you think, okay, well, I need to take myself apart, right? Because there's a piece that's broken somewhere. And then you might think, well, let's assume it's a little piece to begin with. That's the right mechanism. It's like, okay, you got a C-. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. And now it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible. Might imply that you're a bad person even. But you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. Assume that you're the least amount of reprehensible and ignorant possible. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C- in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's while you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, oh, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. And so what you want to do is it's like the old adage, you got to stand up for yourself, but you don't want to make unnecessary enemies. That's a really good thing to know. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time, but now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies, though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Start little, and you do that with people around you too. Like if you have a child, you know, and the child does something that isn't right, then you think, okay, minimal necessary intervention. What can we do to decrease the probability that that's going to occur in the future? So that's a good thing to know with children. It's also a good thing to know with your partners. You're having an argument with them. It's like, okay, what the hell do you want? What's the minimum thing you can request from them that would satisfy you? And the evil part of your soul is going to be, I want them cringing in a corner. It's like, yeah, get that stuff under control, man. See if you can figure out what that person could offer you that would be minimal that you would accept. And then tell them that. It's like, here's the words I would like you to say in the apology I would like you to formulate, assuming that you think you did something wrong. We have to argue about that because maybe you didn't. But if you did, I want to specify it precisely and narrowly, and I want to give you an escape route. And you know, you might only be able to do it badly because you're still mad. So you apologize half-heartedly. It's like you get a pat on the head for that. Good. Next time it'll be 51% not half-heartedly, right? So it's careful training. It's careful training of yourself and other people with the goal in mind, but also with the least amount of harshness possible. And then the other thing to do as well, and this is also true for you, and this is something I learned from studying the behaviorists, is like watch the people around you like a hawk. Whenever they do something that you think is good, you tell them. That's wisdom, man. You'll get so far with that you cannot bloody well believe it, because most people, you know, they're afraid of any number of things, but one of the things they're really afraid of is that now and then they'll creep out of their cynical shell and try to do something good. You know, it's like they're popping out this thing that's unbelievably vulnerable. They'll try to do something good and creep right back into their persona, and they'll look around and see if anyone noticed. And sometimes they'll get punished for it, and then, well, then they won't do it again, so don't do that. But then, now and then you think, hey, I saw you do this. That was actually pretty good. And they think, oh, wow, someone noticed. You know, it's like, wow. And then they'll think, yeah, I could do that again. And if you want to live with someone for a long period of time, I would say every time they do something that you would like them to do more of, number one, notice. Number two, tell them, right? Because I know you don't want to, because you really want to dominate them, and you don't want them thriving, because then they'd be competition to you, and you wouldn't be able to go complain to your mother about what a miserable partner you have, and you know how delightful that is. So you have to forego all that pleasure if you actually help your person develop. So you got to get over all that. It's really annoying. So, you know, you've got this person pegged as, yeah, you're stuck with them, and you know, maybe it's the best you can do, but you got one eye open. And then every time they do something good, you don't want to notice, because if that elevated them a little bit, you wouldn't be able to feel so resentful and miserable and keep your eye open for the next possible affair. And that is what people are like. That is what people are like, and that's what you're like too. That's what people are like. So you got to decide if that's what you want, or you want to help the person that you're with grow. You know, now it's dangerous because they might outshine you. Well, good. Then you have someone to compare yourself to. That'd be a good deal. It's really rough with kids, you know, because parents will stop their children from succeeding beyond them. They get jealous, and then they'll put them down, and then they have kids that do not like them, and they'll pay for it. Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So for example, you can get up in the morning and you can think, well, you know, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, you know, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you got to fulfill my responsibilities, and I want to, you know, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you. It'll say, well, you know, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks. You should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes, and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for 72 hours straight. And say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You got to have some aims, whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend You have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. You know, some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell. So why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, you know, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number one, nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. You know, that's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that? You know, if you don't know what you should do with your life, you don't know who you should be, sometimes you think about that as what career you should pursue. But here's another way of thinking about it. It's kind of a SEAL's ethos that Congressman Crenshaw detailed out. Here's some things you could be. Those are my words. These are his. You'll be someone who's never late. You will be someone who takes care of his men, gets to know them, and puts their needs before yours. You will be someone who does not quit in the face of adversity. You will be someone who takes charge and leads when no one else will. You will be detail-oriented, which you discuss a lot in later sections of the book, always vigilant, attentive. You will be aggressive in your actions, but never lose your cool. You will have a sense of humor, because sometimes that is all that can get you through the darkest hours. You will work hard and perform, even when no one is watching. You'll be creative and think outside the box, even if it gets you in trouble. You're a rebel, but not a mutineer. You are a jack of all trades and master of none. And then you follow that a little later with this paragraph, these paragraphs. Be aggressive enough to kill the enemy, but immediately calm enough not to scare the little old lady. You'll be that man who's mentally tough enough to operate in horrific chaos, then immediately transition to tranquility, all without mentally breaking. You will effectively transition from hyper-masculine aggressor to gentle caretaker. You'll be both a warrior and a gentleman. The qualities that made SEAL leaders great were rarely physical in nature. They listened. They empowered their team to be successful, carefully entrusting individuals with additional responsibility. It's a real conservative ethos there. They highlighted good performance publicly and criticized bad performance privately. And so, well, you know, those are lists of virtues, and maybe they're not the only list of possible virtues, probably not, but if you're lost and you don't know where to start, practicing, you know, you also talk about this idea that, this is an Aristotelian idea, you know, that we are our habits, we become what we practice, and imagine if you're lost and you're listening, you think, well, you find some things admirable, well, you could practice those things, and you can practice them locally and minimally in your own relationships, and you can start to get good at them. And as you get good at them, well, you get better at them, right? And then you can broaden out the scope of your action into
a wider purview. So you said here too, let's go for another quote here. Throughout your life, this is very practical advice too, and I think it's very wise from a therapeutic perspective. Throughout your life, you have people you look up to. Okay, so let's think about that. You look up. What does that mean? Why up? Well, up is something that beckons from a distance. It's like a light on a hill, and we automatically assume that those who we admire are people we look up to. So that specifies a distance and a direction, and it's uphill. It's up toward a higher vista, let's say. So there are automatically people who elicit that spirit in you. You have noticed the way.
It might also imply that there's some sense of struggle required to get to that point, because it's easier to go downhill than it is uphill.
Yes, definitely. That's right. It's an uphill trek. And it also implies judgment, because if someone's above you, then they also serve as a judge, or you serve as a judge in relationship to them, because you compare yourself unfavorably with them. And that can also inspire you to tear them down. That's really the story of Cain and Abel, and that's a major story. You have noticed the way a teacher, parent, coworker, mentor, or friend interacts with others, and you come away thinking, that behavior simply works better. They are respected, admired, and successful. And you find yourself wondering why that is. You do if you're a little bit humble instead of being envious, right? Because otherwise you think, well, that damn crook, he just stole his position, and that's why he's got it. But if you're a bit humble, you might think, well, no, that guy looks successful. Maybe he knows something I don't. You are noticing attributes and character traits that are good and worth aspiring to. You are noticing attributes that make certain people more successful than others. You are noticing what a hero looks like. And in the process, you are discovering a path made up of desirable personality traits that helps you ascend in social hierarchies. That's Jacob's ladder, by the way. That ladder that is the hierarchy to the good. That's the vision Jacob has of the pathway to God, is that it's a hierarchical structure with the thing that's ultimately good at the pinnacle, by definition, right? The best of all possible goods. And then there are intermediary structures all the way up, and beings inhabiting those structures. And this isn't metaphysical. It's like if you find someone you admire, the reason you admire them is because they're higher up in that heavenly hierarchy, so to speak, than you are. And your whole nervous system tells you that. You're compelled to listen, you're compelled to pay attention by the action of your own unconscious mind.
You know, what's interesting about this point of identifying these heroes or at least role models, you can call them either one. I just thought heroes was a more compelling word to use for the sake of writing it. But what's interesting about it too is how pop culture actually plays a pretty important part of this, because like there's plenty of people who simply don't have these good role models in their lives, and you have to acknowledge that. And so where are they supposed to turn? And it's maybe one of the reasons that it's so important to fight these cultural wars that you and I engage in on a fairly regular basis, that they become a serious part of our politics, which at the same time is necessary, but also deeply, deeply unfortunate. I do think the attack on pop culture from this progressive victimhood left has reached a ceiling. I think there's a serious backlash. You look at movies like Top Gun, the recent one, Top Gun, and maybe like the highest grossing of all time. Absolutely phenomenal movie, really fun to watch. Why? Because it just had all of these classical virtues infused within it, about relationships and about how you treat people and what the consequences are for treating people as such. That these things speak to people in a deeper way. They can't necessarily articulate them, but they understand it when they see it. And there's these sort of radical minorities that are very loud that want that changed. You know, they want something else to be on that hill. But people react against it because it's not true. There's no truth to that.
And something cries out from inside of them then, and that can be appealed to by a storyteller. I saw the same thing in the Marvel Avengers series, is that there is a return to any wide range of classical virtues, certainly brotherhood, a kind of a military ethos, sacrifice, a striving upward, certainly masculine virtues, the combination of the Hulk and Iron Man, for example, there's a monstrous element to the Hulk, but he's a hero in a strange sense, and he's also the revitalizing force for Iron Man when he just about dies, and that's all. The reason those movies were so necessary and so attractive is because they are, in fact, addressing a radical conceptual void in the culture, and it's a void that, well, that you're addressing in your book, especially with your appeal, well, trifold appeal, let's say, to duty, responsibility, and humor at the same time, right? Which is a kind of stoicism in the face of catastrophe. You know, so, because this is a big problem in life. Imagine you're aiming for something and then something happens to make it impossible, or you find out that it's the wrong thing because you were aiming in the wrong direction. Well, so then what do you have to rely on to set you right? It's not your aim, obviously, but it might be your capacity to take new aim, and that's bloody well dependent on your character. That's for sure. And so I don't think there is a more fundamental aim than what you should be, and there's no better way of characterizing what you should be than that you should fortify your character. You need structure, you need predictability, and you need more of it than you think, just to keep you sane. Now, if you're lucky, and maybe a bit odd, you can deviate 5% from the norm, or 10% from the norm, or something like that, carefully and cautiously, as long as the rest of you is all well ordered in a normative manner. You might be able to get away with that, and you might be able to sustain it across time, and people might be able to tolerate you if you do it, or maybe you'll get really lucky and you happen to be creative but reasonably well put together, and people will actually be happy that there's something idiosyncratic and unique about you. But even under those circumstances, mostly what you want is to have a routine that's disciplined, that's predictable, and bloody well stick to it. You're going to be way healthier and happier and saner if you do that. And then the other thing that you need, because this is one of the things the psychoanalysts got wrong, I think, is that they overestimated the degree to which sanity was a consequence of being properly structured internally, you know? Because from the psychoanalytic point of view, you're sort of an ego, and that ego is inside you. And of course, it rests on an unconscious structure, but the purpose of psychoanalysis is to sort out that unconscious structure and the ego on top of it, and to make you a fully functioning and autonomous individual. But there's a problem with that, because the reason that you're sane as a fully functional and autonomous human being isn't because you've organized your psyche, even though that's important. The reason that you're sane, if you have a well-organized unconscious and ego, is because other people can tolerate having you around for reasonably extensive periods of time, and will cuff you across the back of the head every time you do something so stupid that people will dislike you permanently if you continue. And so what people are doing to each other all the time, just non-stop, is broadcasting sanity signals back and forth, right? It's like you smile at people if they're not only behaving properly, but behaving in a way that you would like to see them continue to behave. You frown at them if they're not, you ignore them if they're not, you shun them, you roll your eyes at them, you manifest a disgust face, you don't listen to them, you interrupt them, you won't cooperate with them, you won't compete with them. It's like you're blasting signals at other people about how to regulate their behavior so frequently, well, it just makes up all of your social interaction. That's why we face each other, and we have emotional displays on our face, and we're looking at each other's eyes, and we know as much as we can about what's going on with each other, given that we don't have immediate access to the contents of their consciousness. And so partly what you're doing with your routine is establishing yourself as a credible, reliable, trustworthy, potentially interesting human being who isn't going to do anything too erratic at any moment. And everyone else is around there tapping you into shape, making sure that that's exactly what you are. And that's how you stay sane. And so what happens to people too, if they don't have a routine and they get isolated, is they start to drift. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt
It isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least, over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1,000,000, and two persons away from 1,000,000,000. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life, and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. Because that's what happened in the 20th century. You don't have to necessarily have done anything wrong for things to get completely out of control. It's a terrifying doctrine, but it's not a hopeless doctrine, because it still says that there's a way forward, there's a pathway forward, and the pathway forward is to adopt a mode of being that has some nobility, so that you can tolerate yourself and perhaps even have some respect for yourself as someone who's capable of standing up in the face of that terrible vulnerability and suffering, and that the pathway forward, as far as the existentialists are concerned, is by, well, certainly by the avoidance of deceit, particularly in language, but also by the adoption of responsibility for the conditions of existence and some attempt on your part to actually rectify them. And the thing that's so interesting about that is, well, two, as far as I'm concerned, and some of this is from clinical experience. You know, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world and another way that you could act in the world. So what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. My experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. Something, I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be who knows how much more efficient, 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that.
But yeah, I had this crazy professor that I met at the University of Alberta when I was about 18, and he was quite the bizarre person. He vanished one day about 20 years later. He got on a bus in Winnipeg and to go visit his family and never showed up, and they never found a trace of him. Anyways, at the University of Alberta, he worked as the psychologist at the maximum security prison that was located nearby, and he took me out there a couple of times, and so that was quite the hair-raising experience. And I met some pretty serious psychopaths in the Edmonton maximum security prison. And he was a funny guy. This Thauberger was his name. He used to give us multiple choice tests. He did a course on creativity, and now and then he'd throw in a multiple choice test question, and all 4 answers would be the same, which I thought was, I guess that was creative, and it was certainly funny, I thought. And you know, some of the students really hated him, but I thought he was great. He was really cool. And what did he say about suicide? You can always do it tomorrow. Yeah, well, you know, that's pretty good. It's pretty good. That's a pretty good piece of advice. It's like, you know, you don't get to do it twice if you're successful. So is it not possible just to wait? You know, can you just wait? And that's pretty generic advice, but it's definitely worth thinking about, you know, because it's final act. Then I would say too, let people around you know. You don't want to keep that a secret. And if you don't have anyone to tell, really it's time to go to the hospital and tell someone. And you tell, when you go to the hospital, you say, I'm suicidal. And I have a plan, and here's my plan. And that's, by the way, how you assess someone for suicidality, you know. Because depressed people, lots of people get depressed, will have suicidal thoughts, and they're far from rare. And so then you might ask yourself, well, how do you know when someone's suicidal? And they're suicidal when they say to you, you say, well, do you ever think self-destructive thoughts? And they say, you know, yeah, you know, in my father's house, there's a basement and there's a pistol down there, and it's in the top right-hand corner of the bureau, and I know the bullets for that gun are in the bottom left-hand drawer. And you know, I've taken that gun out of that drawer and I've toyed with it, and I thought, you know, my parents are leaving next week for a weekend, and they won't be back, and I could go into the bathroom and put the barrel in my mouth and end it. It's like, that's a suicidal person. And you know that because they're not just being plagued by vague thoughts. They have a fully detailed, implementable vision of their death, and that's not good. And so if there's anybody in the audience who has that sort of fully fleshed out fantasy, I would say, tell someone, you know, tell someone, or more than one person. Tell the closest person you have to someone who cares, you know. And if you don't have anybody to tell, then go to the hospital and tell them, because the probability is pretty high if you're suicidal that there's actually something wrong with you, that you're ill in some manner, you know. And maybe you're depressed, but there's a lot of reasons to be depressed. Sometimes you might be depressed because you just have a terrible life, and that's very complicated. But sometimes you're depressed because you have an immunological condition, an inflammatory condition, or you know, you're ill in some way that hasn't been diagnosed, or you have seasonal affective disorder and your circadian rhythms are off. Like, there's a lot of reasons that you can get desperate enough to be suicidally depressed, and there's always the possibility that that can be fixed. And so, and it's tricky, because when you're depressed, you definitely think that the future is dismal, and you know, the past is dismal and the present is unbearable and the future is definitely worse, and it's all your fault besides. And that's basically the depressive cloud. It affects everything. It's very low level, profound, deep brain and psychic state. But it's generally rectifiable. And, you know, since you can always do it tomorrow, you might as well run the whole gamut of treatments before you make the final decision. So that's what I would tell people who are... Oh, and the other thing too, you got to understand too about suicide is that if there are people around you that love you, it's pretty likely that they'll never really recover. And so, you know, you might be thinking that if you took yourself out, you'd be doing the people around you a favor, but... And often people who are depressed, they really believe that. But, you know, I've had lots of clients who were pretty damn traumatized by a familial suicide, and they just torture themselves for the rest of their life thinking, you know, what if... Well, I had one client, for example, her relative committed suicide an hour after she missed a phone call from him. It's like, how the hell do you recover from that, you know? Because you just think, well, you know, if I would have just been there, and then you can't talk to the person about it. There's no real way of rectifying that. You just live with that guilt, and it's a pretty damn awful thing. That's why most societies regard suicide as a crime, you know, because you leave an aftermath of catastrophic destruction in your wake, and that's also not a good thing. So, you know, if you're depressed, you're going to think it's going to be better for everyone else if you're just gone, but generally that's far from the truth. Almost inevitably, it's far from the truth. So those are some things you need to know on the suicide analysis and prevention front. There are people who are neurologically damaged, who have physiological reasons for difficulty in maintaining optimized attentional focus. You see that in people, for example, who have fetal alcohol syndrome. Most of the time, as far as I'm concerned, it's a rubbish diagnosis. Panksepp, the same neuroscientist that I talked to you about, who investigated play behavior in rats, also noted, this is quite fun, that if you deprive juvenile male rats of the opportunity to play boisterously, they become hyperactive. And also, if you deprive them of the opportunity to play optimally, their prefrontal cortices do not mature well. And the prefrontal cortex matures late, and it constitutes, in some sense, the pinnacle of neurological development. And it needs to develop in the course of intense play. And then he noticed that if you administered hyperactive, play-deprived rats amphetamine, Ritalin, that it would inhibit their frenetic playing. And that's pretty much what's happening in schools. So the schools are not well adapted to boys. I don't think they're particularly well adapted to girls either, by the way, but they're particularly not well adapted to boys. Boys aren't designed to sit still and be bored out of their skulls for 7 hours a day. And there are boys with particular temperaments who are even less inclined to be able to do that. So, for example, if you're extroverted, highly social, possessed by a fair bit of enthusiasm and positive emotion, then you're going to appear more hyperactive. If you're creative, then your attention is going to be fragmented in some sense by the multiplicity of your interests. So if you're creative and extroverted, then you have both of those working against you in terms of your quiescent adaptation to the school environment. If you're disagreeable, which is also more likely if you're male, then you're quite likely to push back against what you see as stupid, arbitrary rules. And so we know perfectly well, for example, that attention deficit disorder overlaps with childhood conduct disorder and antisocial behavior. And I'm not saying that all children diagnosed with hyperactivity are conduct disordered. I'm saying that more aggressive boys tend to manifest symptoms that sometimes tilt them towards juvenile criminality and sometimes tilt them towards attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. But it's partly their somewhat rebellious temperament. And so if you're disagreeable and extroverted and creative, then why wouldn't you be hyperactive? When amphetamines were first used to treat hyperactivity, the hypothesis was the following. Kids who are hyperactive or attention deficit disordered are of a different neurological type. Now, as I said, in rare circumstances, that's true. But absent evidence for neurological dysfunction, I would hesitate to make that presumption. The run-of-the-mill hyperactive boy, if you put him on amphetamines, Ritalin, his attentional focus improves. Now, the original hypothesis was that's because these abnormally neurologically structured hyperactive boys have a paradoxical reaction to amphetamine administration. It calms them down, whereas with normal people, they become more stimulated, okay? There's a word for that theory, and the word is wrong. Okay, so more intelligent and differentiated analysis has indicated that if you give any child amphetamines, the grip of what they're attending to is stronger. So all children are calmed down by stimulants perversely because the psychomotor stimulant, which is a dopamine agonist, which activates the focal exploratory system, does increase the capacity for focal attention. But it does that with all children. And so a positive reaction to amphetamine in relationship to attentional focus is no indication whatsoever, even in the most minute manner, that the diagnosis was correct. And so I don't buy it, except in these rare cases, is that we use amphetamines to conveniently modify the behavior of bored boys because we're too stupid to construct our education systems in a manner that doesn't drive them mad. Look, normal university students take Ritalin like mad in university because they learn that They can sustain attention. Whether that's productive or not in the long run is a whole different issue, but they can sustain attention with less effort if they use amphetamines. Now, that's a degenerating game, fundamentally, like most drug use. And I suppose if it's very carefully regulated and the doses are low, then the negative consequences are less dramatic. But I think the whole thing's just, it's a psychosocial fraud. It's a, what do they call that? When a system produces there's a name for a disease that's created by doctors. I can't remember it. What's the word? Iatrogenic? Iatrogenic? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, hyperactivity is an iatrogenic disease created by schools. Yeah, that's the case. So, boys should play more, way more than they do, way more. They should play to the point of exhaustion in some sense every day. Really, really. They'll quit when they've had enough.
I have no direction or goals in my life at the moment. What can I do to regain my compass in life?
Well, you talked about that a little bit in your intro. So there's this line in the New Testament, which is kind of mysterious, you might say. But it's really an instruction set. And the line is approximately, knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. And you think, well, no way, that can't possibly be true. But it's true if all of that is undertaken seriously. So one of the things that Tammy and I learned to do when we were trying to adjudicate our arguments, and we both tried to abide by that, was like, if I'm upset with her, let's say, it's clearly because she's done something wrong. One of the things that I'm required to do is let her know what my conditions for satisfaction are. It's like, what do I want? And I have to be able to tell her. And I might object, well, if you loved me, dear, you'd know what I want. And people say that to each other all the time, and they should immediately get slapped for that. It's just like, I'm too stupid to know what I want, let alone figure out what you want. You don't even know what you want. So it's good to kind of clue your partner in. Here's what I would, now that doesn't mean once you let the person know that they're necessarily going to deliver it, but they might, especially if you also allow them the luxury of doing it stupidly and badly, at least to begin with. You know, your wife might tell you, when I put some effort into getting ready to go out, I'd like you to say something nice. It's still a bit vague. It's like, okay, dear, exactly what would you like me to say? Well, that's an annoying thing for your wife to have to think through, and it's annoying for you maybe to have to mouth those words, but, you could do it stupid and badly 20 times and maybe get a little expert at it, and by the 100th time, you're like world expert at compliment deliverer, and you can encourage her to pursue her interest in attire, let's say, and why isn't that a good thing for both of you? And so, but that's all dependent on whether or not you're willing to let yourself know what you want. And that's all dependent on whether or not you're willing to ask. And so one of the things you can ask yourself, and this is very useful, is what would your life have to look like in order for it to justify itself to you? And so why would I put it that way? Well, your life is hard. It's full of suffering. It's full of malevolence, for that matter. It's full of malevolent suffering. That's coming for sure. And that's a heavy burden to bear. And you might say, well, it's so heavy that nothing at all could possibly justify it. And I think that's not a productive attitude. I think if you watch your life, you see that there are things that will grip you that do appear to justify the weight of existence. And I think you can commune with yourself, which is a form of thought. It's a form of meditative prayer, but that's a form of thought. And the thought is, what do I want? If I could have what I wanted and needed, what would that look like? And you might say, well, why would I associate thought with meditative prayer? It's like, well, what the hell do you think you're doing when you're thinking, if it isn't praying? It's the same thing. You first of all, you formulate a question. What do I want? And then you ask it. And you might say, well, who are you asking? Well, you're asking yourself. That would be the classic modern answer. It's like, well, if you're the person with the answer, why did you have to formulate the question? And so what are you doing when you formulate the question? And what you're doing, really, what you're doing is you're opening yourself up to revelation. And you might say, revelation from what? And that's a good question, no doubt about it. But in some sense, it's a revelation from the ground of being itself. You know, you ask yourself a question. If I could have what I needed and wanted, what would that look like? You'll get a dream, you'll get a vision, and it comes to you. That's the most accurate way of describing it. It makes itself manifest in the theater of your imagination. And in precise proportion to your willingness to actually formulate the question. It's a rather frightening question, you know, to find out, to allow yourself to ask yourself what it is that you really need and want, because you simultaneously make the conditions for failure clear to yourself. And people like to keep that sort of thing foggy and vague so they don't have to hold themselves accountable. But that's a dreadful mistake. That's why I wrote Rule 3, do not hide unwanted things in the fog. It's like you should sharpen your aim. You should specify your goals. Now, the price that comes along with that is you'll know when you fail. But the advantage is you'll know when you fail. You can learn. Now, more practically, you don't know where you're going or why, the person who asked this question. So let's decompose the problem a little bit. I don't know what to do with my life. Well, that's a pretty vague problem, because your life that's a big, complex, multidimensional thing, and the probability that you're going to be able to formulate an answer to the question, what's the meaning of my life, is pretty much zero. Because, well, what do you want, a one-sentence answer? Like, it's a one-sentence question, you think there's a one-sentence answer? That's not helpful. And so what I often did practically in my clinical practice, and this is useful to know, especially if you're a bit lost, is, well, where do people generally derive their sense of meaning? And it's not that complicated to figure that out. And this is also a conservative perspective in some sense. Well, most people need or want an intimate relationship and some family interaction. Maybe that's children, maybe it's with your parents or your siblings, but zero family interaction is generally not part of the optimized human condition. Most of us would like to have a friend or two. We need a job or a career to keep body and soul together, but also so that we're in harness and we can pull against a weight that in a noble and productive and generous manner. We perhaps need to be engaged in something creatively. We have to take care of ourselves mentally and physically. We should adopt some civic responsibility. We need to protect ourselves against major sources of hedonistic and impulsive temptation. There's 8 things. It's like, well, pursue one of them. Start there. You know, when I dealt with my clients who were depressed, unhappy, let's say, the first thing I would do with them is walk them through that analytic process. It's like, do you have anything in place in any of these domains? Sometimes I had people who were doing pretty good in all 8 areas and were still unhappy. Those people were depressed, technically, right? Because their lives were actually in pretty good order, but they were miserable. There was something wrong with them. They were ill in some way that was lowering their mood, and destroying their positive emotion. Other people would be batting 0 on all 8 fronts. Like, they weren't depressed, they just had terrible lives. And so, really, and so what I would do with those people is, well, look, like, here's 8 things that aren't in place in your life, it's no bloody wonder you're miserable and everything seems meaningless except for the suffering, because that's a meaning too. It's like, why don't we start working incrementally in a few of these areas, and then we can just evaluate and see if that's helpful, and it's almost invariably helpful. You know, and part of that is, well, specify. You ask yourself, well, what do I need that I don't have? Well, maybe I'd like to have a partner. Okay, well, I can't just leap from not having a partner to being happily married in one fell swoop. There's intervening steps. One of the things I used to do with my clients who were lonesome is say, well, look, have you tried online dating? No, I'm too afraid. It's like, well, no wonder you're afraid of it. You have your reasons. But we could start small. It's like, why don't you write out a dating profile? Don't post it. Just go online one of these sites and write out a profile. Who are you? What do you have to offer? And what do you want? Think it through. Write it out. Come up with a coherent story about a coherent representation about who you are. And then figure out what you want and see how that works. We can play that through. And then maybe when you develop that in a manner that feels solid to you and reliable and genuine, and you've also developed a vision of the person that you're trying to attract, that would help you feel confident in your happiness. If you actually met that person, well, then you're ready to go. Launch it on the site and talk to the person. You know, first maybe it's just text, and then maybe it's coffee, and you know, there's incremental ways of doing this, and you can do that with all of those 8 domains. It's like, get yourself a life. And if you're firing on all cylinders in all 8 dimensions and you're still depressed, and this is a specific answer to the person formulating this question, if you're still unhappy, you should probably go see someone, because you're probably sick. You know, if you've got all of those, if you have all that skill and you have all those relationships and activities in place, and you still are suffering an excess of anxiety and pain and insufficient hope and motivation, it's highly probable that something's afflicting you that's in the nature of an illness. But if you have none of those things, it's like, well, it's no wonder you're miserable. Misery is the default human condition in the absence of sustaining meaning, just like hunger is the default condition in the absence of food. And you need productive engagement, productive, generous, reciprocal engagement, in order to provide you with the genuine meaning that sustains you in life. And the pathway, a lot of the pathway to that is pretty pragmatic and practical. You got no friends? That's likely a problem. You're a creative person, you have no creative outlet? That's not going to work out for you. No, you're lonesome because you don't have an intimate relationship? That's a source of pain. Those things have to be rectified, and you can do that incrementally, and that works. So that's a practical pathway to incremental improvement. And one of the things that's cool about that, because you might be thinking, oh my God, this is hopeless. I don't have any of those 8 things. I might as well just end it all tonight. It's like, and people certainly think that, you know, and I'm not making light of it. One of the things that's very much worth knowing is that a lot of positive emotion is dependent technically on the observation, on your personal observation that you're moving towards a valued goal. See, not that you've attained the goal. So imagine that you're in your hopeless situation and you decide, well, I'm going to work on the relationship front. Now you develop a vision of what a relationship might be like, and you posit that as a promised land, let's say, and then you differentiate that so you can make incremental steps forward, and the incremental steps are small enough so that you actually take them. As soon as you start to take them and you observe yourself moving forward in relationship to that goal, then first of all, you'll be stabilized on the anxiety front, because now you have a purpose that's finite and defined. And second, you have positive emotion, because you experience positive emotion in relationship to observing yourself move towards a valued goal.
So right away, you don't have to attain the goal in order to be meaningfully engaged. You just have to be on the pathway forward. And so you can benefit from this almost immediately. And if you want to do something practical, I have a program online at selfauthoring.com called Future Authoring that helps people develop a vision on these 8 different dimensions, along these 8 different dimensions that I just outlined. And you could go and do that, do it badly, because you're not going to get it perfect anyways, and then get humble enough to make the incremental steps small enough so someone as useless as you might actually do them, and then away you go. And that works out. We used this program, for example, we had students in 3 universities, but I'll talk about one, vocational college in Canada. We had all the students who were going to this vocational college. We divided them into 2 groups. They either wrote for 90 minutes about what they had done in the last 2 weeks in their life, or they wrote for 90 minutes about their vision across these dimensions that I described. They didn't have any training, no warning, except that they knew they were going to participate in the study, and no one even reviewed what they wrote. And we dropped the dropout rate of those students by 50% in the first year. All they needed was a compelling vision, and that's what we all need. We all need a compelling vision. We're visionary creatures in the literal sense. We need a compelling vision. And one of the things our society does very badly is to encourage people, is to let people know that they are visionaries and to encourage them to develop for themselves a compelling vision. It's very sad that we don't do that, especially because if you do that with people, the results are spectacular and immediate. And one of the things that's been heart-rending, I would say, for both of us, going around the world talking to people, is people frequently stop me on the street and say, the story is in some sense archetypal, although the details vary in interesting ways. I wasn't in a very good place. I was suffering, and there's usually reasons for that. And then I listened to your lectures, which of course are predicated on the observations of brilliant clinicians and psychologists, and so the ideas aren't attributable to me. They're just great ideas. I listened to your lectures, and I started developing a vision and attempting to put my life together, and things are way better. It's like, what's so sad about it's very pleasing to hear that in one sense, because the upside of the story is the improvement, right? The movement away from the catastrophe. But the downside of the story is twofold. First of all, the catastrophe was there to begin with. And second, it didn't take much encouragement to fix it, which brings the question right up to the forefront. Why the hell wasn't that encouragement there to begin with? Why are so many people dying on the vine for lack of an encouraging word? Because it's definitely the case. That pertains to the mental health of young people. And it's in no small part because we do everything we can to punish the spirit out of young people. We especially do that with boys. But we're pretty good at, you can't do that to boys without doing it to girls too in the final analysis, because we're basically stuck with each other. So develop a compelling vision, and one that you're the one who judges whether or not it's compelling. You want to formulate a vision such that you apprehend the vision, you think, oh my God, if I could have that, life would be worth living. Well, yeah, that's what you want. And you might find that you're actually not that hard to satisfy. That what would satisfy you, fill you with hope, stabilize you psychologically, is actually within your grasp. And certainly my experience on the clinical front was that was the case. One of the things I loved about being a clinician, I really loved this, was that generally my clients who were genuinely aiming up, because not all of them were, but most of them were, the ones who were genuinely aiming up made rapid progress. And it was extremely engaging and entertaining to work with them on that. You know, we'd set goals. I want to triple my salary in 3 years. That was fun. It's like, okay, that sounds like a war. How might you do that? And it was extraordinarily entertaining to plot that out, to strategize about it like it was a full-fledged war, you know, but a war for something positive, and a war that would benefit the person who won and also the people around them. And that's well within your grasp. There's any number of things that are right in front of you that you could radically improve with the right vision, and that would result in radical improvement, and not just for you, but for everybody around you. That's just right there in front of everyone. And it's particularly true if what's around you is pretty dismal, because if what's around you is pretty dismal, there's just no shortage of opportunity for improvement. Might be difficult, but man, there's lots of possibilities sitting there as well. So aim up, get a vision, man, and pursue it. And the more of us that do that, the better things are going to be. And it would be better if they were better than if they were worse. And we're certainly trying to sort that out on the cultural front at the moment. It's like, let's aim up, eh? Because down is very deep hole. And maybe we don't want to blunder into that again.
There's this idea that philosophers have developed in the last 50 years called performative contradiction. It's like a lie. Normally, you think of a lie as you lie when you say something that you know not to be true. And there's different forms of lies. There's sins of commission, lies of commission, where you literally say something and you know it not to be true. And then there are lies of omission, where you have something to say and you don't. And classically, people have regarded sins of commission more seriously than sins of omission. But sins of omission, they're not nothing. And you know, I've read studies that purport to demonstrate that if you ask people when they're older, you know, what they regret most in their life, it isn't the mistakes they've made, it's the opportunities that presented themselves to them that they never took, right? That's a sin of omission. I think it's an open question. You know, maybe your life would be long enough, even though it's short, maybe your life would be long enough if you took advantage of everything that came your way. Maybe you'd exhaust yourself in the pursuit of that opportunity so that you could be content with the finitude of your mortal existence. If you didn't avoid and hide things in the fog, let's say, that's rule number 3. Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Your own future, all that opportunity. Do not do what you hate. You go to work and you hate it, right? You're forced to do things that you don't want to do, that grate against, not your lack of discipline, right? We have to get that straight, not your immaturity. You have to, if you're resentful, you got to ask yourself, you know, are you just immature or are you being tyrannized? No, those are the questions. And the probability that you're immature is very high if you're resentful, but it's also, well, it's the case for everyone, right? It's like, have you fully grown up? It's highly improbable. And well, you know people, you know what they're like, you know yourself, that you're still 13 in some ways. And I could see this in my clinical clients often. It was so interesting watching them talk, because especially if they had been hurt at some point in their life, they would literally, I could see them transform right before my eyes. I saw one woman once who talked to me about a very traumatic experience she had. Her mother put her in a grocery cart, and it was on a hill. And she rolled down the hill in the bloody grocery cart, and it spilled her out. And she ended up in a hospital and under the care of a pretty damn psychopathic nurse. And it really tilted her towards paranoia for the rest of her life, right? She was so shocked, first of all, that she got hurt, and second of all, that when she went for help, she encountered someone malevolent who actually, what would you say, fed on her pain She never recovered from that. And then when she was telling me the story, she was like a 55-year-old woman. She was 5. Like everything about her just shifted, like her tone of voice, the set of her face, the voice she used. You could just see that part of her had come to one crash and halt in the out-of-control shopping cart that hit the pavement hard when she was 5 years old. And this hate. There's this idea in the New Testament, it's a very tricky idea. There's one unforgivable sin. People have argued forever about what that is. Because the idea, that one of the ideas our culture is based on is that if you've made mistakes in your life, but you admit to them, so that's to confess, let's say, and then you repent, which is to figure out what the hell you did wrong and decide to do better in the future. And that can be very hard if you did something really wrong, so it's not like it's an easy thing to do. It's difficult in proportion to the magnitude of your failure to aim, let's say. But that if you do that properly, no matter how far you've strayed, that you can be set back on the proper path, right? That you can be forgiven and that you can then move ahead. And we better hope that's true, because there isn't anybody anywhere who hasn't done many things that were pretty damn dark. And if it was all only the case that we were done when we made a mistake, then, you know, the jig's up for the rest, for everyone. And so you need justice, because you can't get away with everything or even anything perhaps, but you need mercy too. And mercy is, well, the same. You apply that to your children as well. You know, they make a mistake or multiple mistakes, and perhaps even more so when they're teenagers. And the basic rule is still, you know, try to do better and you're still welcome, fundamentally. And that's a good rule. That's a really good rule. What would interfere with that process of redemption, let's say, and maybe that's your decision not to abide by the dictates of your own conscience. So you tell yourself, I shouldn't be doing this, whatever it happens to be. Maybe you don't find your job meaningful, and not that that's a simple problem. Or maybe you're really called upon to do things at work or in your family life, or just to save your good name that really do disturb you, and yet you do them anyway. And then you practice doing that. You make that into a habit, and everything you practice, that becomes you. This is true neurologically. If you repeat something over and over, if you practice it, you build the biological structures that make you an expert at that. And so if you're practicing violating your own conscience with a performative contradiction, this other form of lie, this willingness to act out things that run contrary to your own sense of morality, right? So you act out a lie, well, then you become the embodiment of a lie. And, well, there's endless metaphorical speculation about the spirit of the lie, right? I mean, that's one of the characterizations of the great adversary of mankind, you know, is the prince of lies. And you allow that to take up its residence within you because you're rationalizing doing what you hate, then you do that at your own peril. And if you get really good at that, maybe there's no way back. The danger of being an actor, you know, is that you become the actor and then you lose you, obviously. You replace you with that falsehood, and that will make you bitter, to lose you in the service of a falsehood. And then, you know, once you're bitter, then you're vengeful, and once you're vengeful, then you're, what's next? Fratricidal. That's Cain, by the way. And once you're fratricidal, the next step is homicidal, and the step past that is genocidal. And, you know, you can walk down all those steps, and people have lots of times. And every one of us has something in us of all of that. That's for sure. And you don't want to practice that. if you write a book, which is virtually impossible, and then get a publisher, which is virtually impossible, you probably have a rejection rate of 99%. So then if you do manage to publish the book with a reasonable publisher, which you won't because it's impossible, then you get 8% royalties. That's it. So 92% of your labor goes to the sales, marketing, and distribution end of things. And so it's very, very difficult to generate capital as an entrepreneur. And there's innumerable impediments. One of the things that people do, and this is something for those of you who might be entrepreneurially minded, here's another thing that you have to understand, is that you can't really create a product and then launch it. Because first of all, you don't know how to do that. You might know how to create the product, but you do not know how to market or sell it. You don't know how to advertise it. You don't know how to communicate about it. You don't know how to ship it. Like, there's all sorts of things you just don't know. But worse is you don't know if people will use it. And so what companies do that roll out new products on a relatively continual basis do is they don't develop the product and then go sell it. They continually communicate with their customers about what product the customer is willing to buy next, and then they develop that. And so you have to have your market identified, and then you have to be in continual communication with the market while you develop the product. It's not, I build a better mousetrap and the world comes, marching to my door. That isn't how it works. Is that you got to find out if someone wants to buy your stupid thing. And then the next thing is that even if you have a great thing, you're going to go talk to people and they have 50 great things that they might buy. And they're all great, but they're not going to buy all 50. They might buy one, maybe, and maybe they'll buy it this week, but probably they'll buy it in 6 months. And they're not going to buy any of them, no matter how great, unless they're on fire and you're selling water. Because they're so busy already, right? They're so overwhelmed and preoccupied by their jobs that if you come in and you say, well, here, this is going to increase your efficiency by 20%, and here's the 3 weeks you'd have to spend doing that, and then the payoff would come in the next years, they'll say, yeah, well, I'll do that as soon as I have time. And as soon as I have time is never. So if they're on fire and you have water, you can sell it to them. But that's all, because otherwise it's a no-go. So those are all things that are worthwhile knowing, because they're very hard to learn. And very comically, I mean, if you would have told me when I first started developing these tests that one of the reasons corporations wouldn't buy them was because they worked, that I would have just thought, really? I mean, come on, really? That's really the reason? It's like, yeah, that's the reason. God. So very, very, very problematic. And then they already have their processes in place and they're entrenched. And then the next problem is, you haven't got any customers. I think I told you that before. You don't have any customers and you show them the statistics, but they can't understand the statistics. And they also have 200 other people selling them things, and 50 of them are crooks. So they're just lying about what they're doing, and they can't tell the difference between the liars and the people who are telling the truth. And so they can't understand the statistics for themselves, and they can't verify them anyways. So what they ask you is, who else is using it? And if the answer is, well, everybody, then you don't even have to do the sale because you're already rich. And if the answer is nobody, then they're going to say, well, why is nobody using this? You say, well, it's the hottest thing that's come along. And they think, well, I'm not going to be the sucker who gets painted, red and fired because this failed. That they do not think this might make me succeed. People do not care about whether or not they succeed. They care about whether or not they fail. And so that's another thing, is that if you're marketing something and you can say, this will stop you from being identified as a failure, then people might be happy about that. But if you say, this will really help you succeed, it's like, yeah, no, I don't want to succeed. I just don't want to fail. I don't want to succeed. I just want to be invisible and be left alone. And if you're looking for people's fundamental motivation, that's it. They want to be invisible, and they want to be left alone. I tell you the zebra story? Any of you know that story? Okay, I'll tell you this zebra story. Stop me if I've told it to you before. This tells you everything you need to know about human beings. So it's worth knowing. Okay, so zebras have stripes, and people say, well, that's for camouflage. And then you think about that for 2 seconds, and you think, that's a really stupid theory, because lions are camouflaged, and they're like golden like the grass. And zebras are black and white, so you can see a zebra 5 miles away. It's like, there's a zebra, it's black and white. So the whole camouflage thing, that's just not working out so well as a hypothesis. Okay, so biologists go and they decide to take a look at some zebras. And so they're looking at a zebra on the herd, because there's no zebra
right? Just like there's no fish. There are schools of fish and there are herds of zebras. There isn't a fish. This is why I think the cod aren't coming back. There are no cod. There are massive 100-mile long schools of cod, 10 stories deep, 20 million years old. You wipe out the school, you don't just get to throw a cod in the water and say, well, you know, off you go. It's like, well, where's my city? It's like launching you in the middle of a field. It's like, well, go out there and reproduce. It's like, no, that's not going to happen, you know? So without the school, there's no cod, and you can't just introduce a whole school of cod because you don't have a whole school of cod. So, you know, maybe the cod are never coming back. And zebras are the same thing. There's not a zebra. There's zebras. And so you're looking at the zebras, trying to study a zebra, and you look at the zebra and you make some notes and you look up and you think, oh Christ, which zebra was I looking at? And the answer to that is you don't know, because the camouflage is against the herd and the black and white stripes. There's a variety of reasons for the stripes. Flies also seem not to like the stripes, but you know, usually things evolve for multiple reasons. But anyways, it's very difficult to parse out a zebra against the herd. You look down, you look up, it's like, uh-oh. All those damn zebras look the same. Yes, the camouflage is effective, but it's against the herd. All right, so then you think, well, we better identify a zebra so we can see what he's up to. So then you take your Jeep and a can of red paint and a stick with a rag on the end of it, and you drive up to the zebras and you paint their haunch red a little bit, put a nice red dot on their haunch, or maybe clip their ear with a cattle clip. And then you stand back and you think, hey, I'm pretty smart, now I'm going to watch that zebra. So what do you think happens to the zebra? The lions kill it. Right. Because lions, they're smart, right? Hunting animals are smart. But they have to identify a zebra before they can organize their hunt. They can't just hunt the whole herd. They have to pick out a zebra. And so maybe it's like a zebra that's got a sore hip or something. And so you think, well, nature's kind. It just takes the weak. No, zebra or lions like really healthy, delicious zebras. But they look like all the other healthy, delicious zebras, so they can't get a bead on them. But if they're small and just born, or if they're limping, or there's something that identifies them, then the lions can pick them out. And then they do pick them out. And so the rule for human beings is keep your damn stripes on so the lions don't get you. And I'm telling you, man, if you want to remember one thing from my class about human motivation, that's a good thing to learn. People camouflage themselves against the herd, and they like to be in the middle of the herd, which is what fish do, by the way. If you have a big school of fish, the smart, healthy, large fish are in the middle of the school. Because you know what you call fish on the outside of the school? Bait. Right. So that's what people are doing. They're trying to move into the middle of the herd all the time. And the herd moves around, or the school moves around, and people are going, well, I'm in the middle. I'm staying in the middle here. So I've got this protective ring of people around me so the predators don't pick me out and do me in. So, okay, so that's part of the reason why I said, well, you can't sell something to someone for success, because you're thinking, well, people are aiming at success. Don't be thinking that. It's not by any means necessarily true. Trait neuroticism is a powerful motivator. And trait neuroticism is, let's not be too threatened or hurt, right? That's the negative emotion system. And the negative emotion system is a killer source of motivation. You also see that there are scales of well-being that have been designed, mostly by social psychologists, which means they're very bad scales most of the time, because their psychometric capacity is absurdly low, generally speaking. So what you find with scales of well-being, sometimes they're talked about as scales of happiness even, is that people aren't after happiness, they're after not hurting. It's not, so they don't want to be extroverted and enthusiastic, right? And bubbly and full of smiles and laughter. That isn't what they mean by I want to be happy. What they mean is I don't want to be anxious or in pain. And so well-being scales tend to be something like emotional stability plus extroversion. But the big loading is on emotional stability, the reverse of neuroticism. You want to avoid suffering. You don't want to be happy. You want to avoid suffering. And one way to avoid suffering is not to let the lions gnaw on you. And one way of doing that is to stay in the middle of the damn herd. And so, like, I'm not being a smart aleck about this. I understand why people do that. There's real danger to being visible. There's real danger in being visible. Now, you might be successful if you're visible, but you also might be dead.
Once you orient yourself, then you have an obligation, I would say an obligation to the development of your soul to speak the truth. You have to be oriented properly, though, because the truth is is something that exists in service to an ideal of sorts. Then you can imagine that you could use your language two ways. You can use your language to manipulate the world and to extract from it what you want. So for example, maybe you go out on a date with someone and you decide that the end goal of the date is to have a sexual partner for the night, and then you can craft your language to manipulate the person into providing you with what you want. And that's like an instrumental use of language. But the problem with that, there's many problems with that, but one of them is that what if your idea about what you should want is wrong? Like maybe that's not the way to treat someone that you're on a date with, out on a date with. Maybe you're minimizing and reducing the interactions between you from what could be a healthy and elevated state of interaction and discourse to something that basically the pursuit of impulsive pleasure, and maybe that's not good for you next week and the week after and a month down the road. Maybe orienting yourself towards impulsive pleasure is a very bad idea. Remember what happens in Pinocchio. Pinocchio goes to Pleasure Island, and Pleasure Island is a place where impulsive pleasures can be had at a moment's notice. But what Pinocchio discovers, along with Jiminy Cricket, that Pleasure Island is run by masked totalitarians. They're all dressed in black, you remember, and they're turning the children and adolescents who are on Pleasure Island, they're depriving them of their voice, turning them into braying jackasses, and preparing to sell them as slaves to the salt mines. And so there's an implication in that story that the pursuit of impulsive pleasure is one route to totalitarianism and slavery, and I believe that. So perhaps orienting your language towards the gathering of impulsive pleasure is a misuse of your highest gift, the gift of logos, the gift of communication. The alternative is to orient yourself towards the highest good, as we already described, and then speak the truth. And you can tell when you're doing that or you can tell when you're not doing that, because if you're not telling the truth, if you're using someone else's words, you're being manipulated in a sense by forces that are behind the scenes. You're not using your own words. You're the puppet of an ideology or another thinker or your own impulsive desires. And you can tell when you're speaking like that because it makes you feel weak. It makes you feel weak and ashamed. And you can localize that feeling physiologically. If you listen to yourself talk, you can tell when you're speaking properly, you will experience a feeling of integration and strength. And when you're speaking in a deceitful or manipulative manner, you'll feel that you're starting to come apart at the seams. And what you need to do is practice only saying things that make you feel stronger. And that'll mean, to begin with, that you'll notice that almost everything you say is a lie. It's either a lie or someone else's words. It's very hard to find your own words, but you don't actually exist until you have your own words. So then you try to teach yourself how to speak your own truth, and you listen to other people while you're doing that, because they can help you shape and correct your words. They'll react to them badly if you formulate your ideas badly, and if you listen and pay attention, then you can learn to formulate your words more and more clearly and accurately, and that makes you more and more powerful. It gives you more and more authority, which is the beneficial form of power. Okay, so you do that, and then you have to make a decision of faith, and that's basically, that you can either use your language to manipulate the world and make it do what you want, or you can use your language to try to articulate the truth as carefully as you possibly can, and then you can see what happens. You have to let go of your desire for the consequences that you want. You have to assume that if you speak the truth, the results are the best that is possible under the circumstances. And so it's an exciting way of living in some sense. It's like continually walking off a cliff, because you don't know what's going to happen next if all you do is say what you think. And maybe you're at work and you say what you think and you get fired and you think, oh my God, that's a terrible catastrophe. But maybe it's not, because maybe if you're working somewhere and you have to lie to maintain your job, maybe you shouldn't be there. Maybe it's deadening your soul and damaging you in some permanent manner and making you corrupt. And so you have to orient yourself. You have to speak the truth as carefully as you can. You have to listen to others so that you correct your speech. And then you have to allow the consequences that ensue to unfold as they will. That's the ultimate act of faith, I would say. And that's what you do if you belong to Truth University. All right, so more practically speaking, then you should educate yourself. And it's not that easy to do now, because you have to find people who can actually tell you mostly what to read and maybe also how to write, because writing is a way of formulating your thoughts ever more precisely. That's why you go to university, to learn how to write. If you know how to write, you can think. If you can think and speak and communicate in writing, you're unbelievably powerful in the authority manner, because arguments move the world forward, and if your arguments are tight and well constructed and lucid and well edited and carefully thought through, and you have 5 rationales for everything that you're doing, which is what happens if you learn to write properly, then you're like a force of nature, man. No one can take you down. And that's one of the things that people aren't taught about why you go get educated, especially in the humanities. Humanities education, if it's real, organizes your psyche, grounds you, puts you on a rock, and makes you a force to contend with. But you have to read the right people. And those are the great, they're the great people of the past. In my list, they're the great men of the past, and that's just how it is. And so here's who I would recommend. I put reading lists up at jordanbpeterson.com. There's 2 of them. And the people that I recommend primarily are their books written by the following list of people: Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, who I think perhaps the greatest novelist the world has ever seen, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another great Russian novelist. I don't know what it is about the Russians, but man, they produce writers that are incomparable. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, where he analyzed the Soviet prison camp system that arose after the Leninist revolution in the second decade of the 20th century, and details in absolutely precisely how the tenets of Marxism, the Marxist tenets that are supposed to free everyone and change the world, produced legislation that was absolutely murderous in its consequences. And Solzhenitsyn painstakingly traces the logical pathway from the original Marxist principles to the legislation, to the genocides. Because you'll hear people who are basically Marxists say things like, well, true Marxism never existed. And Solzhenitsyn took that argument apart in the mid-70s, and the Gulag Archipelago was an intellectual bomb. It demolished any credibility that Marxism had to intellectual respectability. You have to read the book. The book is about the central issue in our culture at the moment. If you don't read it, you're not informed. You can't participate in the debate except as a puppet. And so I wouldn't recommend participating in this debate as a puppet, because you don't know who's behind the scenes pulling the strings. If you remember the Pinocchio story, the forces that were pulling the strings were not forces that were acting in Pinocchio's best interest, that's for sure. George Orwell, English essayist, incomparable commentator on socialist totalitarianism, even though he was a left-winger and a brilliant one. Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, had some very brilliant things to say about the potential demolition of sexual choice, of sexual partner as a part of a dystopian future. Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who described himself as someone who thought with a hammer. And Nietzsche is a very, very dangerous person and an absolutely brilliant writer. And Carl Jung, who was a student of Nietzsche, and who Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced the death of God back in the late 1800s, and Jung spent his whole life attempting to revivify God. That's one way of thinking about it. And so if you educate yourself, and this is a really good place to start, if you read these authors, then you'll know what else to read. If you read these authors, it'll take you a good long time, and it will be very, very hard on you, and you won't be the same person when you come out, and that's very frightening. And because being torn down and rebuilt is no joke, but it beats the hell out of the alternative, which is just to stagnate and stay a stagnant infant, which is not something I recommend. There's nothing uglier than a stagnant 40-year-old infant.
Well, this is a strange one. I don't know about you people from Sydney. So, it's from Kathy Newman, which strikes me as somewhat unlikely. And it's got 164 upvotes, which is quite a few upvotes. It hurt when you destroyed me on ABC. Now, I don't know if that's referring to last night or so many months ago, but I've enrolled in university to get my facts right. Yeah, well, that probably won't work. Thank you for enlightening my soul. The burns are still healing. Yeah, well, it's not exactly a question. It's 4 sentences that are quite the strange combination. I would say something about the burns are still healing. You know, I mean, Nietzsche said that you could tell much about a man's character by how much truth he could tolerate. which is very interesting. You know, there's an idea in the great Western tradition that the truth is the way and the path of life, and that no one comes to the Father except through the truth. And I believe that to be the case, because I don't think that you can manifest who you are without the truth. And so I think it's literally and metaphorically true that the pathway to who you could be if you were completely who you were is through the truth. And I would say, and so the truth does set you free, but the problem is that it destroys everything that isn't worthy in you as it sets you free, and that's a process of burning. And it's painful, because you cling to what you shouldn't be, partly out of pride and partly out of ignorance and partly out of laziness, and so then you encounter something true, and you all know this perfectly well, because when was the last time that you learned something important that wasn't a blow of some sort, you know? And it's often you look back at your life and you think, oh God, I really learned something there. I wouldn't want to do that again, but it really changed my life. I mean, sometimes it can really destroy you, you know, an encounter with the truth, and you never really recover. But now and then something comes along and straightens you out, and a lot of you has to go. A lot of you has to burn away, you know, and I suppose in some sense the idea is that everything about you that isn't worthy is to be put into the flames. And that's another reason to be not so casual about claiming what you believe, because it isn't something that you undertake without due caution. You know, I learned when I was a kid, about 25 or so, a little older than a kid, that almost everything that I said was one form of lie or another. And I wasn't any worse, I would say, than the people that I was associating with, or any better. And the lies were manifold, you know. They were attempts to win arguments for the sake of winning the argument. That might be one. Attempts to indicate my intellectual prowess when there were competitions of that sort. Maybe just the sheer pleasure of engaging in an intellectual argument and winning. My inability to distinguish between ideas that I had read and incorporated because I had read, but hadn't realized that I hadn't yet earned the right to use, all of that. And, you know, I had this experience that lasted a long time. Well, I would say it's really never gone away. And I think this was the awakening of my conscience, essentially. And I didn't realize this until much later, when I was reading Socrates' Apology. This voice, for lack of a better word, made itself manifest inside me, and it said every time I said something that wasn't true, and that's usually what it said. That's not true. You don't believe that. Or there was a sensation that was associated with it. I don't think this is that uncommon, you know. I asked my psychology classes for many years in a row if they had an experience, that they had a voice in their head, let's say, it's a metaphor, or a feeling that communicated to them when they were about to do something wrong. And it was universally the case that people agreed with one of those statements or another. And the other thing I would ask is, well, do you always listen to it? And of course the answer to that was definitely no. But that's also very interesting, you know, that you can have this faculty, this conscience. This seems to me to be very tightly associated with the idea of free will, is that you can have this internal voice, this daemon, the root word for democracy. Oh yes, I didn't finish that story. So yes, well, it's important. Well, so Socrates' daemon told him it was his moral guide. And democracy appears to be predicated on the idea that the polity will function if people attend to their consciences. That's the overlap of those conceptualizations. And well, first of all, I think that's the case, you know, and it makes a certain amount of logical sense. I mean, if we assume that the political state is something like the emergent consequence of the decisions of all its citizens, we would assume that the wiser the decisions of the citizens, the more upright and functional the state. I can't see how it could be any other way. And perhaps those who are the most upright, who listen to their consciences more carefully, even play a disproportionately powerful role. It's certainly possible. So, anyways, back to truth. Well, you know, I learned that so much of what I was doing was false. And I think I learned this. See, there's a reason that this came to me so clearly. I was trying to understand why people did terrible things. And I was really concentrating on the terrible, terrible things that people do. And I was interested in Auschwitz, for example, and not as a political phenomenon, but as a psychological phenomenon. I was curious about how you could be an Auschwitz guard. And I wasn't really curious about how you could be one, because, well, you could be one, of course. I was more curious about how I could be one, being such a good person as I thought I was. But I also knew that many people did many terrible things during the 20th century, and the idea that I was somehow better than them, or that I should assume a priori that I was better than them, and that I wouldn't have made the same choices or worse had I been in the same situation, was a very, very, very dangerous supposition. And in fact, a sufficiently dangerous supposition to bring about the very danger that I assumed was worth avoiding. I had this idea, you know, that what had happened, especially in Nazi Germany, but also in the Soviet Union, shouldn't happen again. That what we needed to do, because of what happened in the 20th century, especially because we also managed to create hydrogen bombs, that we had become so technologically powerful that there wasn't time for that anymore, that time for that was over, and that we really needed to understand why it happened, and that perhaps we could go deep enough in that understanding, which is, I think, what happens when you go deep into understanding, so that you could stop it. Because if you understand a problem, maybe you can solve it, you know, and at least in part, I came to believe that the problem was, as Solzhenitsyn said, that the problem is that the line between good and evil runs down every human heart. And I was reading Jung at the same time, you know, and he believed that the human soul was a tree whose roots grew all the way to hell, and believed also that in the full investigation of the shadow, which was the dark side of the human psyche, was that it was bottomless, essentially, that it was like an experience of hell. And that also struck me as true. And that the way to stop those sorts of things from happening was to stop yourself from being the sort of person who would do it, who would even start to do it. Because the other thing you learn when you learn about atrocities of that sort, you could read Ordinary Men, by the way, which is an unbelievably great study of exactly this sort of phenomenon. It's on my book list on my website. It's about a group of German policemen who were turned into brutal murderers over a period of months when they went into Poland after the Germans had marched through. And they were just ordinary middle-class men. And they weren't forced into this by their leadership, by the way, either, which is one of the things that makes the book so interesting. So for me, it was a matter of understanding that if we want this sort of thing to not happen anymore, then we have to start to become the sort of people who wouldn't do it, which seems rather self-evident, all things considered, unless, you know, you believe that we're the pawns of social forces, for example, like the Marxists do. And I don't believe that, because we're also the creator of social forces. And we're also capable of standing up to social forces, because I would say the individual is more powerful than the social force, all things considered, interestingly enough, that the way to stop such things from happening, the way to remember properly,
is to understand that you could do it, that you could do those terrible things, because the people who did them were like you. And that the way out of that is to stop being like that. And the way you stop being like that is, well, at least in part, by ceasing to tell yourself lies that you don't believe in, and that you know you shouldn't act out. And, and that's made a huge difference in my life, for better or for worse. I mean, it was a very uncanny experience, I would say, because it's very discombobulating to experience yourself as fragmented enough so that much of what you do and say is actually false. It's a lot of work to clean that up, a lot. But the consequences are, in principle, worthwhile. And so that was part of what, understanding that was part of what drove me towards clinical psychology, saying away from political science and law and from politics in general, because I started to believe that, and I think this is the great Western idea, which people were quite irritated about, by the way, on Q&A last night as well, that the proper route forward for the redemption of the individual and for mankind as a whole is as a consequence of the redemption of each individual. And I truly believe that. And I believe that that occurs as a consequence of adherence to the truth and courage in the face of being. That's rule one, right? To stand up straight with your shoulders back, is to take on the onslaught and to enter the contentious ring and to do more than your best, because your best isn't enough, because your best isn't as good as you could be. You have to push yourself past that. And that's, as far as I can tell, where you find what you need in life. You find the meaning that sustains you in life, and you find the patterns of action that redeem the world, both at the same time. I mean, life is a very difficult business. It's fatal, and it's full of suffering, and it's full of betrayal and malevolence. There's nothing about it that's trivial. It's all profound. And in order to find your way through all of that capacity for hellish experience, let's say, you need to develop a relationship with something that's profound. And you can. You have that capacity. And what could be more profound than the truth? And what would you rather have on your side? And you might say, well, that's obvious, and of course everyone should do that. And then you need to know why you don't. And the answer is, well, sort of encapsulated in this first amusing question, Thank you for enlightening my soul. The burns are still healing. It's like, well, there's no shortage of dead wood to burn off. And there's no shortage of pain when the dead wood burns off. And that's what makes people afraid of the truth. Maybe that's why Moses encountered God in a burning bush. Who the hell knows? But there's something about that idea that seems to me to be the case. And so, what's the decision that you make? You decide to believe. It's a risk, an existential risk. It's an act of faith. You believe that the truth can set you free. You believe that people have an intrinsic divinity about their soul. You decide that you're going to live in that manner, and that you're going to let everything about yourself that isn't worthy of that goal die. And that might be almost everything that you are. And that's a terrible thing to contemplate. The only thing that's worse, I would say, is the alternative. Because the alternative is the sorts of hells that we managed to produce around us, and that we produced with particular expertise during the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And it would be a good thing if we decided collectively and individually not to go back there again.